Boa noite a todas as pessoas que estão aqui presentes fisicamente no auditório CAD, né, Auditório Nobre da Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais. Quero agradecer a todos também que estão online conosco. Quero dar algumas palavrinhas muito rápidas para os nossos convidados internacionais que estarão aqui hoje para debater um tema muito importante, as metodologias de pesquisas mundiais. Antes de passarmos à cerimônia e apresentarmos cada um através do nosso cerimonialista, eu vou tentar dar algumas palavras em espanhol e inglês para todos vocês. Hola, buenas noches para todas as pessoas que estão aqui nos escutando, sobretudo para a professora Marta Lagos, Alejandro Moreno, Bob Matis, Ricardo Reis, de Portugal, e además do professor Paul Beck, de Estados Unidos. Queria dizer-te que sou Marateles e estou muito contenta com a participação de vosotros e estou aqui também representando a Abrapel, a Associação Brasileira de Encuestadores Eleitorais. Dejo com vosotros um desejo de êxito em la cerimônia e nas discussões. Primero, Bob Mates e Paul Beck, welcome. I'm here in Brazil, and I wait to say the welcome to our seminar, international seminar, and thank you for your participation in our activity. I wish for you uh, uh, welcome for us. And now I will start the activity. Thank you. Gracias.
Thank you all. As Professor Mara said, this panel will be in English, so for all the Brazilian listeners, I will ask you to pay more attention. I would like first to introduce our former coordinator of this table, Professor Antonio Lavareda. Professor Lavareda has a PhD in political science by the UPERJ and a master in sociology by UFP. He participated as a coordinator or strategy consultant in 91 major campaigns for president, governors, senators, and mayors across the country, having also worked in Portugal and Bolivia. He's currently director, president of MCI Strategy, president of the Scientific Council of IPESP, founder of NeuroLab, Laboratory of Applied Neuroscience, and collaborative professor of the postgraduate program in political science at UFPE. As Professor Mara said, he is in Portugal, so he couldn't be here with us today. So he sent a video that we will pass later. But now I would like to call the new coordinator, that will be Professor Clóvis de Oliveira. Professor Clóvis holds a degree in social science from the Universidade Federal da Bahia, UFBA, a specialist degree in Latin American Studies, and a master's degree in sociology from the University of Pittsburgh at the USA, and a PhD in political science from the Instituto Universitário de Pesquisas do Rio de Janeiro, UPERJ. Held a postdoctoral internship at the Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais and at the University of Delaware. He is currently a professor of UFBA and associated researcher at the research group program A Cor da Bahia and Grupo Opinião Pública. He is also a member of the project team, the Collaborative Study of Race in the Americas, team building in the 21st century, founded by the American Political Science Association. He is also a member of the consultative board of Abrapel. Our first speaker is Professor Ricardo Reis. Professor Reis holds a degree in economics from the University of Porto and a PhD in applied economics from the University of Pennsylvania. He is currently a professor in the accounting department at the Catholic University of Lisbon and director of the Center for Applied Studies, which has provided consulting services in the fields of economics and management since 1982 to various institutions in the private, public, and social domains. He will speak over the election polls in Portugal. Our second speaker is Professor Robert Mates. Professor Mates holds an MA in Political Science from the University of Delaware and a PhD in Political Science from the University of Illinois. He is currently a professor at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, Scotland, and director of the Democracy in the African Research Unit in the Center for Social Science Research at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. He's also a senior advisor and co-founder of the Afrobarometer, a public opinion survey in 34 African countries. He has also participated in the launch and coordination of major projects such as the African Legislature Project and the South African National Election Study, who will talk about election polls on the African continent. Our third speaker is Professor Paul Beck. Professor Beck holds a master and a PhD degree in political science from the University of Michigan in the United States. He has authored and co-authored 5 books and over 100 articles in edited books and academic journals. Before retiring, he was chairman of the political science department at The Ohio State University and dean of the College of Social and Behavioral Science, in addition to being a distinguished professor of social and behavioral science at the institution. He's currently professor emeritus at the Ohio State University, where he taught for 25 years until 2012, and co-chair of Comparative National Election Studies, which has conducted 54 election surveys around the world. We will address the theme, election polls around the world. Our fourth speaker is Professor Marta Lagos. Marta Lagos holds a master's degree in economics from the University of Heidelberg in Germany. She is founding director of Latino Barometro and a member of the World Value Survey Association, and is part of the Comparative National Election Studies. He is also a member of the board of directors of FINAN, the World Bank for Women, and a consultant to the UNDP, World Bank, and the EADB. He is also a member of the United Nations Committee of Experts on Public Opinion. She will present the Latino Barometer research methodologies. Our fifth speaker is Professor Alejandro Moreno. Alejandro Moreno holds a degree, a PhD in political science from the University of Michigan in the United States. He teaches at ITAM, where he has been a professor for 25 years. He is specialized in studies of public opinion, elections, and electoral behavior, as well as social and political values and comparative perspective. He's currently the director of public opinion surveys at El Financiero Bloomberg and serves as vice president of the World Value Survey Association, WVSA. He coordinates survey in more than 100 countries. He is also managing director of the Latino Barometer Study, a biannual survey conducted in 18 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. His presentation will be about electoral surveys in Latin America. Now we will pass the Professor Lavareda video, and then I will ask for Professor Clovis to start.
I was asked to give a short speech from Lisbon on behalf of the directors of ABRAPEL, Brazilian Association of Electoral Research, the President, Mara Teres, the Vice President, Marcela Montenegro, the General Secretary, Silvana Kraus, the Treasurer, Josimar. National Director, Maurício Garcia, and the Communication Director, Rodolfo Costa Pinto, as well as the members of the Advisory Board, the Editorial Board, and the Fiscal Council, and everyone who is part of the entity. It is with great pleasure that ABRAPEL greets you all this evening, when it holds the last activity of the first international seminar on electoral research held in Brazil. The table will be coordinated by Professor Clovis Oliveira and addressing the theme, the methodologies and challenges of electoral research in the world. On this occasion, we will have the presence of 5 guests, distinguished experts who are referenced with great international notoriety. They are Paul Beck, Robert Max, Marta Lagos, Alejandro Moreno, and Ricardo Reis. I'm sure they will contribute to promote a better understanding of the current stage of development of this field of activities in other countries and continents, allowing Brazilian researchers and all those who attend this seminar to absorb these experiences. The challenges posed to the holding of free elections and the contestation of their results have grown throughout the world, increasing the risks to the survival of liberal democracies. The threats are many, and nevertheless, all that has been reflected upon, as the political scientist Adam Tversky reminds us, we still have only limited understanding of the process by which democracy collapses, and how bitter will be the lessons we will learn, we do not yet know. Whatever the variety of instruments used by those who despise democracy, one of them is sure to be to show discredit on electoral service. That's why, especially in these times, they have been under attack in Brazil. Besides questioning their results, there has been recourse to fake servers widely disseminated in the media and social networks, a special category of fake news, which deliberately seeks to misinform and disorient society, opposing the data of their institutes that work seriously and professionally. At first, they aim to influence voters, encouraging their followers and discouraging those who would vote for other candidates. But afterwards, they will probably serve to feed the distrust in the counting of the electronic voting machines and even justify the contestation of electoral official results. As we know, the role of electoral polls, the real ones in elections, is extraordinary, participating actively in the process that's crucial moment, the most important moment in the operation of the democratic systems. They often guide the choice made by the parties on the names that will compete in the election, assist in defining the best positioning and communication strategies of the candidates, and are indispensable for the press that uses them as the central axis in the coverage of the campaigns. And most importantly, they are fundamental to promote the electorate to the condition of decisive observer that through them gives their opinion on each relevant step of the candidates, on what they approve or disapprove of their proposals, and how they evaluate their behavior before and during the campaigns. Moreover, many voters use the information they provide on the distribution of preference to sometimes change their own original choice and vote strategically, giving up their initial choice to prevent a rejected candidate or party from being victorious. These are some of the most well-known roles of service, those published in the media, carried out and published in the blink of an eye. They directly empower citizens in the day-to-day of the campaigns. But there are, alongside others, made with even greater depths, which involve more time on meticulous planning, greater methodological elaboration, hypothesis testing, and more refined statistical tests. Their product is, let I say, slower consumer and more lasting repercussion. These are researches with a more academic flavor that will further serve to foster scientific debate and enrich this field of studies. We will hear about this and much more in this roundtable with its brilliant participants. I will stop here, wishing everyone to make the most of it. Thank you all.
Loves, your mic is muted.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm honored to be here to host this closing roundtable of the first meeting of the Brazilian Association for Electoral Research. I'd like first to thank Professor Mara Teles and Professor Antonio Lavareda for inviting me to participate in this event. It's important to stress that this panel brings together leading experts in the electoral study and the political scientists and social scientists from different regions of the world to talk with us about election polls and around the world. In order, this panel will be composed by distinguished presence of the following research: Paul Beck, Robert Metz, Marta Lagos, Alejandro Moreno, and Ricardo Reis. Now I'd like to invite Professor Paul Beck to present his communication. It's gonna discuss about election polls around the world. Paul Beck is co-director of the Comparative National Election Project. He's from the University of Ohio, United States. And so we're gonna start with that presentation. Good evening, Professor Paul.
Good to be here, and thank you for inviting me. And it's good to have so many old friends participating in this panel. Good to see all of you. Should I go ahead and present? I do have a PowerPoint presentation that should be shared, but I can, let's look at the first slide if we can. Yes, there it is. I just want to say a couple of things about this first slide. One is to call your attention to the website for the Comparative National Election Study. It's a website that is hosted here at Ohio State University and contains a lot of information about the CNEP, as we call it. And what I'm going to do is talk about the Comparative National Election Project and give you some of the highlights of it. We can now go to slide number 2. Okay, I'm trying to go to slide 2. There we go. Okay, the CNEP has conducted now 66 surveys in 30 different countries. 16 of those surveys have been done in multiple countries, more than one survey in those countries. And we continue to do surveys. Some are planned for 2022. In fact, one in Colombia that will be in the field very, very soon. What you can see from this particular slide, and it may not be clear to you because the print is pretty small, but we started out with 4 countries in CNEP1: Germany, Great Britain, the United States, and Japan. Then we moved on to CNEP2 that added a whole group of countries, some in Latin America, some in Europe, one in Asia, Indonesia. Then we moved to CNEP3, where we were including a lot of new democracies, particularly in Africa, but elsewhere as well. And then in CNEP4, we have done a total of 39 surveys so far, including the Colombian survey that's coming up. And you can see that we have really picked up in terms of the number of surveys. Let me spend a little bit of time talking about each one of these phases in CNEP. We can now go to the next slide. As we have moved along with the project, we have developed new foci over time. We started out with, and please go to the next slide if you can. We started out with started out with kind of a normal election study, normal study of voting behavior. What was a particular feature of CNEP was that we were focused on what are called intermediaries. And what we mean by intermediaries are groups or individuals from which information is passed on to the individual respondent in the survey, the individual voter. And so we were focused really on 4 different things. And if you would go to the next slide, we can show those. There we go. In terms of intermediaries, we wanted to focus on the media. We wanted to focus particularly in the media on newspapers, television, and radio. It sounds like the old world, by the way, no internet there at that time. We also were focused on personal discussion networks. We were focused on secondary associations as intermediaries, as providing information to voters as to how they should think about that election. And we also were focused on political parties and the contacts they were making with voters. So it was kind of a standard voting study. In addition to that, we were focused on intermediaries that had not really been studied very well since Lazarsfeld and his colleagues at the Bureau of Social Research at Columbia back in the 1940s. When we brought in new countries in CNEP2 between 1993 and the year 2000, we were focused on, and many of these were new democracies, by the way, we were focused on the democratic consolidation process and attitudes towards democratic participation. We were focused on value orientations. We think of these as sort of issue positions, but issue positions that are generic so that they can be compared across countries rather than being unique to a particular country. And we were focused on social cleavages. The surveys for CNEP3 were conducted between 2004 and 2007. What we added there were understandings of the meaning of democracy to respondents in those surveys, and we were focused also on the quality of democratic elections in those countries. Finally, CNEP4 from 2008 to 2022 focuses on democratic deconsolidation. Some of the new democracies, some of the old ones, like the United States maybe, don't seem to be as democratic as they were before. We're focused on the threats to democracy. We focused on the internet, which had emerged in the 2000s and became very important as we went through the rest of those 2 decades. We focused on social media via the internet. We focused on new themes in populism, new themes on fake news. Now, one thing to say about these 4 foci, from CNEP1 all the way through CNEP4, is that you could think of them as added questions, added focuses, added themes, and it meant that the questionnaires that we're using got very crowded. And so what we had to do along the way was remove some old questions that didn't really appear to be very beneficial in studying voting behavior, and add to those some new questions, new developments. The best example probably is the internet. We didn't know anything about it in the early 1990s, and in fact, all the way through most of the 1990s. And we only began to examine it in the 21st century. Now, I thought I'd give you an example here of one of the results that comes about because we have so many countries and so many different elections. One thing that we've looked at is political polarization. And we take a look at polarization between the government party, the leading government party, and the leading opposition party. And we look at their leaders to see how, on a thermometer, a feeling thermometer, how those leaders are evaluated. And what we find is that the champions, I'm embarrassed to say, in the United States are the most recent elections where political polarization is profound, very widespread. Over 50% of people in the most recent election were deeply polarized between the leaders of the 2 parties, in this case, the Democratic Party leader Joe Biden and the Republican Party leader Donald Trump. but you could see the polarization was climbing over the course of the 2000s, very different from what it was in our first American surveys back in 1992. So that hopefully whets your appetite for what we can do with CNEP data. The great advantage here is that we have the same questions over time, and we have it for a multitude of countries and a multitude of elections, even within those particular countries. Now, Mara had invited me and all of us to talk about some of the issues and challenges that occurred with, in this case, the Comparative National Election Project. And what I'd like to focus on are 5 different areas of issues and challenges. One is creating a Common Core questionnaire. Always a challenge. The Common Core questionnaire that we're working with at present can be downloaded from our website that is posted right there. The listing is right there. It builds on past surveys. We add new items, as I said before, to accommodate new realities, but it means we need to eliminate some old items to make sure that the length is not too substantial. As it is, we have over 100 items, and that's a lot of items for a survey, even for a face-to-face survey, but certainly for an internet or a telephone survey. And what we've been challenged by is how we can get cooperation among all of our different collaborators, each of whom is conducting his or her own survey, usually with their own funding, usually with other collaborators who are not a part of CNEP, who are also wanting questions on that survey. And so we've tried to make sure that by having a Common Core questionnaire and insisting that people use those questions, that at least we have a basic set of questions that are asked in all countries. We sometimes fail there. Sometimes the challenges of getting all those questions in are insurmountable, and people have to drop some out, and that just happens, and we are living with that. One of the things that I think is a prominent feature of CNEP is that we merge all of the individual surveys into a single analysis file. That means we need to standardize the variables. And my colleague here at Ohio State, Dick Gunther, and I, particularly Dick, have worked very hard to be able to standardize these variables. So anyone doing analysis of the now 60 surveys in our merged file can go to a particular variable and see what the responses are on that variable, what the frequencies are across all the countries that have asked those questions. Standardization is very important. It's been very important in making comparative analysis feasible. We have weighted the data in 2 ways. In some cases, the countries themselves imposed weights in their surveys, and we've used those. And then what we've wanted to do is make sure that we've equalized the number of respondents across countries. And so we equalize them at 1,200 respondents per country, so that China, for instance, that had, I believe, 3,600 respondents, doesn't overwhelm Argentina, that only had about 700 or 800 respondents. We now are working with Merge 60 surveys, a total of 104,000 cases. It's not available to everyone. It's available only to CNEP participants. The one that's available to everyone is Merge 53, that of course is working with only 53 surveys and a smaller number of cases. We quarantine the most recent surveys so that the individual PIs will have an opportunity to work with those data. And then we release them from quarantine as people are done with them, but no later than 5 years later. We also have had to accommodate different modes of data collection. We initially had face-to-face interviews. Those became unsupportable in certain countries, partly because of declining response rates. Many of the survey firms moved to telephone interviews, and we have a number of those among our CNEP surveys. In recent years, largely because of cost, we've had to move to online surveys. Some of the most recent surveys, certainly the ones in the United States, have been done online. We've had to accommodate these different modes of data collection, assuming that they're producing comparable data, and I think in many ways they are. In some ways, maybe they aren't, and that can be problematic. We've also wanted to provide access to the scholarly community with the quarantines that I mentioned, and we do that largely through the website. As of today, we have 150 people who have signed on to that website and given us their basic background information. But there are many other people who are using the CNEP data. And then there's the question of financing the surveys. We really haven't had central money to be able to provide financing for those surveys. They largely have relied on country grants. In the United States, from the National Science Foundation, and a few other countries as well were supported by NSF, Britain and France in recent years, Germany in recent years. The Mershon Center, where I'm a resident fellow, has provided some very generous support for these surveys. There also have been support from our department, or our College of Communication, the Department of Political Science, and other sources here at the Ohio State University. Finally, I thought I would just give you a sense of publications and papers that have come about through the CNEP. The two major works are CNEP-centered books. One that is co-edited by Richard Gunther and colleagues, and you can see the citation there. This was published in 2016. The second one also co-edited by Richard Gunther with a different set of colleagues, that was published in 2007. Those contain probably the most data, the most analyses of our CNEP project surveys. There have been 15 individual country books that have been based on CNEP surveys. The most prominent ones are on the Mexican surveys and on the Italian surveys, but there are other ones as well. There have been over 50 articles published in refereed journals using CNEP data. I've got a list of the various journals. They're some of the most prominent journals in political science in a variety of countries are in that list. There have been 63 book chapters. There are so far 20 working papers are part of the CNEP collection. Right now, we have 34 different academics and survey practitioners who are collaborators in the CNEP, and we're always looking for new ones and would welcome participation from anyone else. Well, I'm going to end on that point, and I invite questions later on when we turn to the Q&A part of this particular seminar. Thank you.
Professor Clovis, your mic is muted again.
My goodness. So now we're going to have Professor Robert Metz, Director of the Democracy at the African Research Unit of the Center of Social Science Research at the University of Cape Town, co-founder of Afrobarometer, University of Stretch Cycle in Glasgow, Scotland. Nice to meet you, Professor Bob Metz, and it's a pleasure to have you here. And Professor Roberts is going to talk about election polls in African continent. It's an honor for us to have you here. You may present your communication.
Thank you, and it's very good to be here. It's 12:30 in the morning, so I'll try and stay awake for the rest of the presentation. Do you have my slides now? Okay, so we'll try and move through these very quickly. So just try and stay alert to my cues. If we could just move to the first slide. So the point here is, yeah, you can go to the next slide, please. And the point here is just really to make the point that the goal of Afrobarometer is really a study of citizen attitudes about democracy and governance. And as such, it fits much more into the paradigm of political culture surveys as non-election survey. As such, although, as I'll point out, a lot of research has been generated with regard to voting in elections of political parties. But that's I won't go into detail, but that slide gives you a much better idea of what the goal is. It's both an academic scholarly survey, but our donors, such as USAID, such as the Swedish, such as the World Bank, support us also as an intervention into strengthening democracy in Africa by giving a voice to ordinary Africans. So it's slightly a different type of survey in that regard. Just to give you an idea of how it's grown over time, if you go to the next slide, we started in doing surveys in 12 countries, mostly the low-hanging fruit, mostly the most democratic countries in Africa at that time, 1999 to 2001. And then you could just move through the next few slides to round two. The next slide, round two, grew to 16 countries. Yeah, there's the next slide. And then round three was adding, we were very cautious in the early days, adding 2 more countries in the third round. In the next slide. And then up to 20 countries. And then in round 5, the really big change came when we were approached. If you move to the next slide, which says round 5, please. We were approached by the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, who wanted us to help them collect data for a governance index that they were doing based partially on what the World Bank governance indicators looked like, but focused much more on Africa. And so they wanted some more subjective data to go along with the objective data they were getting from governments and from other NGOs and researchers, and helped us vastly expand the project in round 5 to 35 countries. And in round 5, 6, 7, and 8, we've been at around 35 to 36 countries. You can move ahead to the next slide. So 36 countries in 2014, 2015, and then around 7, we lost 1 or 2 countries in the next slide. And then the very last slide, with round 8, and just what I'll call your attention to in round 8 is we were exactly halfway through the surveys, and we'd done 18 countries when we had to stop because of the COVID restrictions across Africa. And we're out of the field then for anywhere from 6 to 9 months before we could resume this other 18 countries. And that gives this round of surveys also an interesting, it's not a complete natural experiment, but because the countries were sort of randomly lined up on arbitrary data about which countries we were going to do first and second, one can do some interesting time series analysis with the countries that we did before COVID versus after COVID. They are kind of mixed economically, so there are some uses one can make of that surprise form of variation. So the next slide will just tell us about how we select countries. The most important methodological issues are that the country has to be sufficiently politically open for people to answer questions honestly and without fear. We also have to have an adequate sampling frame, and that generally means a census not older than 10 years old, and then also an availability of a local partner. So we do not parachute in to do a survey in a country. We are very conscious of avoiding colonial methods of production of outsiders going in and using locals to mine the data and taking it out. We wanted local partners who both conduct surveys but also do the analysis and disseminate the data within their own countries. Of course, there are other issues about safety and about funding. The next slide will tell us about the methodology. And just the point here is that we still do, and it's very expensive and we have to raise large amounts of money. We are still doing face-to-face surveys in the language of the respondent's choice. So we translate into over 80 countries per round, 80 different languages per round. Because we insist on adequate census frames, we do a multi-stage sample and stratify the enumerator areas by regional or provincial differences, and then by urban-rural differences within those. And so that everybody in the country has an equal and known chance of being selected. And we generally have sample sizes of 1,200, and sometimes we're funds that permit up to 2,400. So now we can turn to the talk much more about what is in the survey with regard to, in the next slide, with regard to electoral research. Okay, again, you can move on one more slide, please. No, I think you moved backwards, so you need to move forward. Yeah. So basically, what do we have in the survey in the Afrobarometer, which tells us about elections, parties, and voters in Africa? So to start off with the next slide, the first set of questions that we provide that have electoral content to them are about partisanship. We ask both, and the next slide, please, whether people belong to political party or identify with a political party, and if so, which political party. So you can please move to the next slide. Oh, again, oh, sorry. Yeah, please, you can stay there, because that's the point I wanted to make, is that because these are political culture surveys, we go out of our way generally to avoid elections, right? So where the CNEP is about post-election surveys, usually in the first 3 months after an election, we try and make sure that our surveys are done halfway between two elections, because we want to avoid the polluting influence of elections in order to focus on more enduring issues of political culture. So in that way, again, it's not a traditional election survey, but there are some things we measure that would be of strong interest to you. And you can go to the next slide, which is we measure partisanship and party identification. The next slide will just give you an idea of the kind of variation you find across Africa. This is in 2014, 2015, 35 countries. You see a vast variation across Africa in terms of people who identify with any political party. But in about half of the African countries, you have 25 to 30 to maybe 35% who are unaligned or independent. But in the other half, you have very, very large samples, and actually the minority identify with a political party. In the next slide, we segment the same by whether those people belong to the governing party, which is the dark color, or belong to opposition political parties. And in some places, our common knowledge about party dominance in Africa is true, that the vast majority of people identify with the governing party. But in many places, the governing party is equally or even a minority party in terms of identification compared to the second and third largest opposition parties. We also ask about voter behavior. So in the next slide, we ask people about whether or not, please, yes, you can stay there. That's also to make the point that party identification is not stagnant in Africa. In fact, this is the levels of support or identification with the governing party in Africa's most notorious one-party dominant systems in South Africa, Tanzania, Uganda, Namibia, and Mozambique. So that's identification with the, say, SWAPO in Namibia, or the African National Congress in South Africa, or CCM in Tanzania. And you see each one of them since 2005 is rapidly declining. So there are really interesting things going on in Africa. The one-party dominant systems have a significant erosion of support for dominant parties. One thing we know that's not happening, though, is that support is not transferring to opposition parties. So that's a really interesting dynamic. Lots of people moving away from the dominant party, but they're moving into the non-aligned category, not to opposition parties. If we move to the next slide, we also then ask about, again, voter behavior. Did you vote in the most previous election? And then at the end of the survey, we asked people who would they vote for if an election were held tomorrow. One of the things we worry about is whether people feel compelled to say they voted. We know across the world that voting turnout questions tend to overreport. We find the same thing in Africa in the next slide. So the diagonal line basically is what we would have if the percentage of people saying they voted was exactly the same as the actual turnout in a given country. We can see almost all the African countries cluster above that line and having overreport. But at the same time, the same thing as we find around the rest of the world is that there is while there is an overreport, that overreport tends to be relatively constant across countries. So while it may be not a valid measure, it can be a reliable measure for comparing across countries. And we even have a few countries, Cape Verde, and I believe that's Senegal, where the percentage of people who say they voted is slightly less than the actual data. We move to the next slide, please. We also routinely have a series of questions about participation in campaigns. So we ask people if they've attended a rally in the recent election campaign, if they went to a campaign meeting, if they tried to persuade others how to vote. Though the asterisk means questions which are not always asked every round. The rest of them tend to be asked across rounds of surveys. We ask people whether they have received a gift from a political party in order to vote a certain way, whether they were contacted by a party. We're working on that data now to understand party campaigning strategies, whether people work for a party, and also whether they contact party officials between elections. And if we move to the next slide, please. We also then have a whole range of questions about perceptions or evaluations of government and political parties. So we ask people whether they trust governing and opposition parties, whether they trust the main institutions of governance, and also job performance of the president, the legislature, and local government, and also how well the government is handling issues around a range of macroeconomic, microeconomic issues, crime and corruption, and also whether opposition parties offer important differences and alternatives to the governing party across various domains. As we'll discuss in a second, one big issue in Africa election research is to the extent to which voting is based on performance or on ethnicity or other non-performance measures. This is just an interesting slide of the dashed line is support or identification for the African National Congress in South Africa. And you can see some really tight relationships over time as that identification is increased. It's as people are more likely to say the country's going in the right direction and that the government is managing the economy well, identification with the ANC goes upwards. And where since 2008, with South Africa's mounting economic woes and corruption, the percentages saying the country's going in the right direction and managing the economy well have gone down, and therefore so has identification with the African National Congress. In the next slide, we also ask a range of questions about electoral integrity. So we ask people whether they thought the last election was free and fair, whether they trust the Electoral Commission, whether they fear electoral violence and fear intimidation, do they believe in ballot secrecy, and do they feel free to vote without being pressured. And then lastly, there's a set of questions around multi-party democracy. And the next slide. That again are consistent with our political culture approach about support for democracy, but this is specifically related to elections and multi-party competition, whether people would want an elected executive, whether they support regular competitive elections, and whether they support the idea of having more than one political party. And lastly, just a word then about the themes that different authors have applied this refers to the themes of articles which have been in the peer-reviewed literature or in chapters or in books. So if you can go to the last slide, please, or the next slide. We've had a range of articles published by various authors about the sources of voter turnout in Africa and issues of mobilization, but a lot of the literature around the driving forces of partisanship and vote choice. So people asking questions about whether co-ethnicity, co-regionalism are the most important forces by where people support a political party, also support for the president, the big man, or whether it's more, rather than being ethnic, whether it's more clientelistic, it's an exchange relationship about the exchange of either private goods or local public goods in return for the vote, or whether even more perniciously, it's straight vote buying of people actually exchanging the vote for handouts of food parcels or cash. We also, people have done a lot of work about the role of fear in affecting voter choice. And of course, as I just showed you, performance evaluations. There's also a sub-literature of Afrobarometer data that's in the published literature about electoral integrity and about people's trust in the electoral system and their perceptions, and to the extent that there are good or bad judges of freeness and fairness of elections. And lastly, there's also a sub-literature out there on the consequences of being a winner or loser, and how that affects supporting winning and losing parties, and how that affects people's attitudes about democracy, and how that affects levels of participation. And just to finish up, if you go to our website, www.afrobarometer.org, the merged data files for each round are available up until round 7. Individual national data sets are also available, both in SPSS and I believe in R. But also, you can see on at the bottom of this page, you do as many of the barometer projects also do. We have an online data analysis program so that you can just go straight to the website and ask basic questions and get basic trends on key variables over time and across countries. And with that, I will hand it over to the next colleague. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Professor Robert Metz, for your presentation. It's a wonderful presentation. It's good to know a little bit more about election polls on African continents, especially because it's something that we don't have too much information here in Brazil and some part of the world. And so it's amazing performance. I'd like now to inform that Professor Marta Lagos couldn't make the presentation, couldn't come to here. And so we're gonna move, and I'd like to invite now Professor Alejandro Moreno. He's professor from the Instituto Tecnológico do México, former president of the Vapor, World Association of Public Opinion Research, former vice president of World Values Survey, and he's gonna present a lecture about electoral surveys in Latin America. Welcome, Professor Alejandro Moreno. It's nice to meet you again here in Brazil, online situation. And you are somebody who we are very familiar because you participate very often in the activity here in Brazil with Professor Mara Teles. So it's up to you to present your communication. Nice to meet you again.
Thank you, Clovis. Thank you. Nice to see you and Mara and all these nice friends and colleagues from all these different and very interesting international projects. I feel like in this panel, I could have actually filled in for anyone. Since Marta Lagos is not here, I could easily speak about Latin Barometer. Or I'm also a little bit familiar. Of course, there is no one better than Richard Gunter or Paul Beck to talk about the CNEP, and no one better than Bob Mattes for the Afrobarometer. But with this multi-hat functioning, I could also speak about the World Value Survey. It is not an election poll, it's not an election survey, but it has been used extensively to understand voters and elections globally. In fact, back in 1999, I published a book on election behavior, electoral behavior, in which I tried to understand political cleavages and value cleavages around the world, mostly in Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and Latin America, based fully on World Value Survey data. And I think it was very helpful, and much of what I found in that old book from the last century, I think it can be reviewed, but it defined much of the way I would see voters in the next decades. But despite my familiarity with all these survey projects, international survey projects, I was asked by Professor Mara Telles to speak about election polls in Latin America in general, but my experience with election polls is mostly in Mexico. And let me tell you, I am assuming, I'm thinking, I'm wishing that much of the audience that is following this talk, we have a lot of Brazilian students, young students, and you're going to be surprised that many of us, or some of us, have been doing this for many years. I started to participate in election polls back in 1988, 1989, not professionally, but as a student. And in fact, in 1990, professionally, when I joined a survey research company. And since then, the practice and the methods of election polling have evolved in my country, in Mexico. And what I would like to share with you is a few lessons, perhaps, that I have been gathering on the way, mostly thinking about those of you who think of election polls as a research tool to understand voters and elections, but also those of you who use election polls as a way of consulting, political consulting, and maybe even as a practitioner candidates in the parties, etc. My experience has been mostly on mass media, and particularly in newspapers. So I could consider myself a media pollster, and I began to do that back in 1998. I mean, being responsible for the polls that were published in a particular newspaper in Mexico City. And I can tell you since then, since I started to do this as a student, in 1988, in the 1988 election, I've been trying to know a little bit about this history, but if there were 20 election polls published in 1988 throughout the presidential campaign, I think we're about right. 20 polls, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, but we had 20 polls throughout the presidential campaign. In 2018, 30 years later, we had more than 2,000 election polls published only during the campaign season. Not all of them for president, many of them for state elections, many of them for local elections, but the National Elections Institute, which is organizing the elections and also monitoring them, keeps track of the publication of election polls. So they reported more than 2,000 for 2008, the 2018 election. So you can see that the publication of polls basically has been multiplying by 100. And that has given us a lot of course, headaches, but also a lot of lessons. One of them is that, at least personally, and I have to say this, hoping that there are students here wanting to know more about the methods and transparency measures and other things about election polling, the first thing I want to tell you, it is a pleasure and very thrilling to do election polling. I've been doing it for over 20 years and I don't get tired of it. Even though when I look at Paul Beck, at Bob Mattis, and I think of myself as someone who tries to do academic work, this side of me, this Mr. Hyde side of me, really enjoys the election polling side. So it is enjoyable. We get to learn a lot about voters. We get to conduct a lot of polling. And that part of polls is not just a research tool. Whether we like it or not, election polls become a political actor, and we have to see it as such. So we are concerned about that, and we have to look at the implications for that. So just to give you an idea, every 6 years we have 32 state elections. Sometimes some of them are repeated because of legal reasons, but 32 plus 3 national elections, 1 for president and 2 for Congress, including the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate. So if you think about 35 state and national elections every 6 years, I've been doing over 140 national and state level elections for, let's say, publishing in some form of media. That is not counting local elections on many levels, so I'm not even going to get into that. But some of these lessons come from those 140 elections. The first thing, or the second thing, because the first thing I said was that it's very pleasurable and thrilling. The second thing is that we really get a lot of information to understand voters, but we never really get to understand them fully. Voters are changing, the electorate change, and we have to, constantly adapt methodologies, ways of asking, and things that have to do with understanding not only voters, but changes in the electorate over time. And at the same time, following the task of trying to inform others about what citizens think and how they think about voting. And these others are not only other citizens, but also the politicians, the political parties, and other journalists. So you have a very specialized public when you look at the task that election polling is about. I think Paul Beck has a lot of experiences about this, since he has also commented election polls in the United States, and he knows how polls become a political actor in itself. At the same time, another lesson is that you have to be open to the methodological plurality. Not all pollsters, or at least public pollsters, I'm going to be referring to the public polls, those that are published, that are known, not the private polls that are for groups or parties or certain individuals, but the public polls that we see in the media. Not everyone does the polls in the same way, and not everyone stays doing the polls in the same way. There is an evolution of techniques, which is driven by the question of how to get more information with high quality and fewer resources or lesser costs. At the same time, you have to keep transparent on what you're doing as a responsibility to the public that is reading or consuming the information that you're giving. One more thing, the next thing is you have to be aware of the country's specific election laws. Each country, sometimes each state within a country, has certain laws about the dissemination of public polling, and this generally includes a ban on election poll publication before the election that may go from 0 days, like in the United States, to 3 days, like in Mexico, to maybe 15 days, like in other countries. So this is something that perhaps you have to be aware of, how the legal context also applies to the conducting of election polls. A major preoccupation is how accurate your work is. The story about Mexico is that we have moments or years in which accuracy is fantastic, other years in which it's not. And it's important to understand how this can be improved. The public expects accurate polls. When polls are not accurate, the polling profession suffers in the reputation, even though maybe it's forgotten the next election, but it is a part of the reputation of polls, how accurate they are, how models of likely voters or estimation of participation may or may not help for that accuracy. But most important also, besides accuracy, it is the contents that you're giving to the audiences or the readers for whom you are publishing all this. And this is, I think, one of the most fascinating parts. The accuracy part is thrilling because you always want to be right within margin of error, and you try to do everything you can to be accurate. But efforts can and should be put into offering information that informs the public about what others think and why. The contents, the issues, the stories that we see behind. For example, in 2018, the now president of Mexico won the elections, attracting a very important proportion of young votes. And those young votes are abandoning the current government party. So something is changing, something is happening. Sometimes the polls are not telling us entirely why, but they are documenting these changes. And it is important to focus on stories and contents beyond what is in the United States usually called the horse race journalism, the carrera de caballos, the horse race, how candidates go ahead or how they tie or how they go down and up during the campaign season. So this part about contents and niches and stories that help us understand voters and the electorates also have to do with how to communicate public opinion polls, how to communicate polling data to the public through the mass media, or even more, through the social media, which is one of the favorite ways of getting information for certain citizens today. So this is a lot of challenges. I don't want to make this longer, but let me show you only a few graphs if I can do that. Let me see if I can. I uploaded this, but if someone can help me about being able to put it. Can someone answer if you can see this? There it is. Thank you. Just very quickly, I have various graphs, but I don't want to go through all of them. Just to give you an idea, when you are doing election polls, sometimes, for example, you see lots of polls throughout the election campaign. And some elections are quite, let's say, in quotation marks, boring because nothing happens. The levels of support for parties or candidates stay relatively stable. But some of them are very exciting because sometimes candidates who came in third place end up winning an election, or candidates who begin in first place weeks and weeks, if not months before the election, end up being in the fourth place. So this is exciting in itself. This is like the horse race journalism, and sometimes the target for accurate polls is fixed. It doesn't change very much, but sometimes it is mobile. And this makes a very, very interesting challenge. For example, here, the polls were able to capture the rising preferences for this candidate, but they were short. The candidate won with almost 50% of the vote, and they were short. So this was really a mobile target that was hard to capture with the polls. But we're also very, very mobile, and the polls were quite accurate. If we look at the accuracy over time in presidential elections, we can see how some of them are within margin of error, which is this square around the election result, which is the dot in white. And many of them are a little bit far, some of them sometimes very far. This is obviously not an accurate poll, but mostly a partisan poll trying to cheer for a specific candidate. And this is important also to keep track not only of what you consider the accurate polls or reliable polls, but to try to have everything that is published, because in elections, partisan polls can be published too, and they are part of the information environment that we see. So in legislative elections, we have seen more accuracy over time, partly because the partisan vote is stronger in legislative elections than in presidential elections, when candidates may make a little bit more noise in terms of measuring accurately. As I said, the election polls have grown over time. As I told you, many of them have to do with how many polls are published during an election campaign. But thinking about only the last final poll from different companies, they have grown impressively. As I said, in 1988, only 20 polls were published throughout the campaign, but perhaps 2 or 3 as final polls before the election. In 2018, at least 40 final polls from different companies were published, if I'm not mistaken. There are metrics to look at the accuracy of election polls. The ones proposed by Frederick Mosteller after the polling debacle in the United States in 1948. They are the basic ones. What's the average error in the poll against the official result? It's called Mosteller 3. What's the average error in the difference between first place and second place, which is called Mosteller 5. As you can see in Mexico, sometimes we have years in which accuracy is very good, like in 2007, 1.9 points of deviation for all the polls published, not for one company, but for all the polls, and sometimes 5.4, like in 2016, in which it was more like a disaster. 2016, I remember, it was a very bad year for the Mexican polls. Some years are very good in terms of accuracy. These are the most accurate years. These are the least accurate years. And also, accuracy has a lot to do with how many polls are published. And how many polls also includes, again, those partisan polls that are not trying to inform the public, but to perhaps animate or cheer for the electorate for certain parties. In 2018, we had companies, I'm going to sound arrogant here, but including our poll, it was impressively accurate, and I'm sorry to say that. But you can see polls that are quite accurate and some of them that are not. As you go from the accurate ones to the non-accurate ones, most of these are partisan polls. So it is important to keep track of them too. And I have a few more slides, but I think that my time is dying off. So I'd be happy to respond to any questions if there are any. Like I said, I could have been delighted to talk about Latin Barometer or World Value Survey, but thank you for inviting me to talk about these polls because, again, and I'm going to say it, as much as the academic work fascinates me, the polling work is very pleasurable and very thrilling. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Alejandro. It's always a good moment to hear about your information, to know a little bit more about your research. And we are sorry, the group, about the loss of not having here Professor Marta Lagos. We're very sorry that she could come here to join the panel today. And she would talk about Latin American methodology. But to complete this final section, we're going to have now Professor Ricardo Reis. I'd like to invite him here to join us. Professor Ricardo Reis. He's a professor from the Catholic University of Lisbon, director of Center for Applied Research from Lisbon Catholic Institute. It's nice to have you here, Professor Ricardo. And it's nice for me to pronounce your name since it's so familiar for us. You are from Portugal. And I hope, nice to meet you here. Welcome here. And
thank you, Klaus.
Nice, very much. So Professor Ricardo is going to talk about election polls in Portugal. And it's a nice opportunity to us to know a little bit more about the experience of developing research in Portugal. And so far, if you feel like talk about Europe itself, it's up to you.
Well, Clovis, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a real privilege for me to be talking to you tonight. It's rather late here in Lisbon and in Glasgow, so we're running a bit off schedule, off usual schedule here. But I would like to talk to you about our work here at Catholic University in Portugal. Concerning polls. The Catholic University has a poll center, a political poll center, right from the inception of democracy in the early 80s in Portugal. It's one of the oldest political poll centers in the country. And it works primarily, as Alejandro was illustrating for Mexico, as a media pollster for the national TV network. So we have been doing this for the public TV station for a while. I'm the director of the center. I'm not a political scientist. I'm an economist background, but I've been heading the center for the past couple of years. And in particular, and that's the experience I wanted to share with you, I've been heading the center throughout the COVID years, and we had up until now, and hopefully we're going to stay there because the pandemic should be over soon. We had 4 different elections taking place in the midst of the pandemic. So that gave us an insight of rapid changing, voter changing behavior over this couple of years. And that's kind of the experience I wanted to share with you over the next couple of minutes. And for us, and this is where I introduce a little bit of Europe, it's hard to disentangle, to distinguish what happened over the last couple of elections in Portugal that has to do with the pandemic and what has to do with the political environment in Europe changing in recent years, namely, or globally, namely with right-wing radical political parties showing up in places that didn't exist. This was the case in the most recent elections in Portugal as well. Portugal has a very conservative political system, which, following up on what Alejandro just exposed, means that the prediction errors between, if we can call them prediction errors, between the final polls and the exit polls and the results is always very small. And this led the population and the political establishment to believe that what we were doing, even a couple of weeks before, was a prediction of results rather than analysis of political situation, which led in recent elections, when there were surprises, people to discredit polls. And that's a dangerous situation for us. I spend a lot of time explaining to journalists that what we do is not prediction of results, it's actually the description of the current situation. With COVID, a lot has changed, and we don't still understand exactly why a lot have changed. A country that used to be very predictable in terms of elections became rather unpredictable. To quote the 4 elections that we had regional elections in the Azores Islands, and those are usually complicated for us to poll. We're the only ones polling there. This time there was a change of government that was a surprise for everyone. Then we had presidential elections in January of 2021. They were not a surprise. I mean, the president is massively popular, so he got reelected easily. So that was not a big surprise. Second place, third place runs were a little bit more tricky in terms of predictions, but that was the only one that was rather normal or standard, because the president is extremely popular. So that was an easy one for us. Local elections were complicated, especially because the mayor of Lisbon changed, and that was also a surprise. I mean, we were not expecting the mayor of Lisbon to change. And then we had snap elections already in January 2022 this year for the parliament, which are the main elections. So they are the ones that appoint the head of government, or end up appointing the head of government, where the result of the governing party was surprisingly good for that party, with an extension of their majority. So out of the 4 elections that we had during the COVID period, 3 resulted in surprise results. And that what explains this surprise. I mean, it could be what explains these differences between the opinion polls a week before the election and the exit polls and the results. The exit polls and the results were very similar, so we got those right, which actually indicates that people are telling us the truth, right? So that when they're not lying to us in the polls. It could be methodology, though the several different companies that do polls here use different methodologies and end up having similar results. So it doesn't seem that methodology plays a big role in this. It could be sample size between the previous week polls and the exit polls. Maybe, but I mean, given that everyone was having similar results, it's likely not that. What we seem to believe that happened is that there was a mobilization, and in particular demobilization of segments of the electorate based on age. So older people stayed home in some of the elections because of the fear of the pandemic, when that conditioned the results significantly. Could have been something that you may experience in Brazil as well, which is radical voter shyness, right? So the typical factor that we saw in the U.S. with shy Trump voters not wanting to tell pollsters that they vote for Trump. We didn't see a lot of that happening in Portugal. We expect that to happen more say in Brazil, with the Bolsonaro voters, or in the U.S. around the Trump voters. It could have been last-minute campaign issues. Those happen in the parliamentary elections. Final day campaign issues that were relevant changed votes. In particular, fear. I mean, so it was easy to instill fear in the voters on those final days. Voter turnout, which is always unpredictable, and COVID, as I mentioned, may have accelerated some of these differences in terms of voter turnout, and the polls themselves. And this is the critical element I wanted to get at. So it's not impossible that the results in the polls ended up having mobilizing effects on the voters. The fact that we had these differences, and the fact that people actually blame the polls for changes in the final results, leads there to be a discredit of polls at this point, and some type of movement to forbid the public disclosure of polls a couple of days before elections. I mean, Portugal has a very liberal law in terms of disclosing polls. We're allowed to disclose polls up until the final days of the campaign, and there's one day of where we're not allowed to disclose polls, and that's the day before the election. But then again, we're allowed to do exit polls, so that's a standard practice here. But now that's being put into question. I mean, should we reserve the right to have these polls? And one of the things that we believe is that polls may have a important role in actually controlling and validating the results, in the sense that it's important to have public, transparent knowledge of polls right before the elections, to understand what's going on. The other reason we think this forbidding of public publicity of polls would be rather useless is that polls would still be done in private and still condition the public discourse for the elections on politicians or of politicians, and hence indirectly still affect the results, and the voters would not know why, right? So and this is a way to prevent this. So one of the things that we are trying to emphasize, and now that we have no elections for a couple of years, we hope, is trying to explain the roles that polls can play in focusing more on substance rather than on who's going to win, right? So we're trying to emphasize issues and polling issues rather than political results alone. So and that's the change that we're trying to emphasize at this point. And by doing that, we are fulfilling the role that the university feels that it had to fulfill back in the early days of democracy in the early 80s, when the university decided to create one of these centers. So without further ado, I'm gonna leave the floor to further discussion using my 10 minutes here. But it was a real privilege to be a member of this panel. And one of the things that we want to have is this experience in that we're developing in Portugal, and we've been developing ever since the early 80s, to become more research-based, right? Rather than just something that we do for the media, something that we can also deliver to academia. And that's also another thing that the university requires at the center. So thank you very much for your attention, and hope you have a good evening in Brazil and a good night in Europe.
Hi, Professor Ricardo. Thank you very much for your presentation. As I could say, you're already the last person, but not the least. Your presentation was wonderful. It's nice to hear about that kind of information, the challenge to make research everywhere. And I'd like to invite the team to join us right now. we're going to conclude the activity, and I'd like to ask you, present one question, final question, also ask for you guys to make your final consideration about the event. João, please bring the group here. No group? Professor Marateles?
Sim. Pero bueno, yo quiero dejarme buenas noches a todos. A nombre de Brapel, quiero agradecer a todos por la ponencia excepcional, estupenda de hoy. Nosotros de Brapel esperamos que esta actividad sea la primera e que hagamos novos contatos para compreender as encuestas eleitorais. And on behalf of Abrapel, I want to thank everyone for today's exceptional lecture. We hope that this activity will be the first and that will make new contacts to understand the electoral polls. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you for all. A nombre de Brapel, agradeço a todos vosotros.
Thank you, Professor Mara. Thank you, professors. The exposition was it was a great exposition. Have those kinds of names, such as yours, in our event is a real privilege. We would like to thank you all. I will talk with our Brazilian audience, so I will change to Portuguese. And again, would like to thank for your appearance today. Boa noite a todos. Este é o encerramento do nosso evento. Foi um evento que trouxemos várias pessoas influentes do Brasil, da América Latina e do mundo para debater pesquisas e como elas são cobertas e discutidas tanto aqui quanto em outros lugares. Para nós, uma associação nova, é uma grande honra poder abrir com um evento deste calibre e esperamos seguir trazendo esse tipo de conteúdo para nossos associados e a comunidade que faz pesquisas eleitorais em nosso país. Somos muitos, somos fortes, somos bons e podemos mais. Muito obrigado a todos e gostaria de reforçar que para obter o certificado de 15 horas de evento, é necessário preencher a lista de presença enviada no chat, além de estar associado à Abrapel. Agradeço novamente a todos e boa noite.